Okay. Sorry for the delay, folks. I was having internet problems, or Zoom was having internet problems, but here we are. Okay. So I'm here today to read chapter 12 of the Bible and the Psyche, Individuation, Symbolism in the Old Testament by Edward F. Edinger. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 4 parts to this, and it is 12 pages long. Let's see how we do. Okay, so I'm reading chapter 12, The Bible and the Psyche, Individuation, Symbolism in the Old Testament by Edward F. Edinger. Exile and Return. The Chosen People. Quote, "You are a people consecrated to Yahweh your God, and Yahweh has chosen you to be his very own people out of all the peoples on the earth." Hello, Tamara, welcome. Deuteronomy 14:2. Here and in many other places throughout the Old Testament, Yahweh announces the special elect status of the Jews. This is a central theme of individuation. Its application to Israel marks the nation as a collective carrier of individuation symbolism and helps to explain the awesome history of this particular people. I'm sorry, this peculiar people. Let me read that sentence again. This is the central theme of individuation. Its application to Israel marks the nation as a collective carrier of individuation symbolism and helps to explain the awesome history of this peculiar people. To feel oneself chosen is one of the features of the ego's encounter with the self. There are several aspects to this experience. One is given a task, an assignment, a transpersonal purpose. This process operates more or less unconsciously in normal living whenever one follows a desire, a talent, or an attachment into some life consequence, such as work, a vocation, a cause, or a relationship. In the second half of life, and as individuation becomes conscious, these libido manifestations take on a different quality. They become imperatives of the self, which one is enjoined to honor in the conscious pursuit of wholeness. 2, one is singled out as separate, special, different. In other words, one is made into an individual, brought out from the state of collective participation mystique. As Rivka Kluger demonstrates, Yahweh separates out one special people to be his in order to bring about his own separation from the many gods of polytheism. Quote, "The Godhead Yahweh, who has, so to speak, grown together from many polytheistic God figures into a God personality, has become thereby a distinct God who stands out from all the other gods. This distinct God now chooses for himself an equally distinct people as his vis-a-vis. Here we see projected onto a people the birth of the idea of the individual who is removed from the anonymous existence in the cycle of nature and placed into a personal, unique fate." Unquote. Many of these references are to a book by Rivka Kluger called The Psyche and Bible. And this particular chapter refers to the idea of the chosen people. As a separate and distinct people crystallizes out among the nations simultaneously, Yahweh is differentiated from the multiplicity of gods. This refers to the parallel aspect of the ego self relationship. The self, seeking its own discrimination, offers the ego a special chosen status. By accepting that offer and living it out, the ego helps to create the actualized self. The chosen people are the elect, which term has an ambiguous double meaning. The elect ones have been elected for a special status, and also they have elected to assume that special role. To be set apart as a special one has both positive and negative aspects. To be specially favored is flattering and inflating, analogous to the spoiled child who expects everything to be according to his wishes. Such Israelites say, quote, "No misfortune will ever touch us, nor even come anywhere near us." Amos 9:10. Quote, "Is not Yahweh in our midst? No evil is going to overtake us." Unquote. Micah 3:11. These remarks indicate unconscious assumptions of the infantile psyche. When these assumptions are contracted by reality, they generate bitter resentment, such as the complaints of the Israelites to Moses. "Why did we not die at Yahweh's hand in the land of Egypt, when we were able to sit down to pans of meat, and could eat bread to our heart's content? As it is, you have brought us to this wilderness to starve this whole company to death." Unquote. Exodus 16:3. However, if the status of special one is accepted consciously and maturely, it is expressed in the attitude of Samuel, "Speak, Yahweh, your servant is listening." 1 Samuel 3:10. 3. One is marked out as consecrated, a possession of God. You are a people consecrated to Yahweh your God. It is you that Yahweh our God has chosen to be his very own people out of all the peoples of the earth. Deuteronomy 7:6. Psychologically, this means that one is required to pay possession, so to speak. Psychologically, this means that one is required to pay constant attention to the inner authority, the self. One has become its possession, so to speak. This state of affairs exposes one to the twin experiences symbolized by the God of love, God's love, and God's punishment. If Yahweh set his heart on you and chose you, it was not because you outnumbered other people. You were the least of peoples. It was for love of you. Deuteronomy 7:7. On the other hand, Yahweh announces, "You only have I known of all the families of the earth. Therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities." Amos 3:2. When the self has been activated, one must diligently consider its requirements. Its approval and disapproval manifest clearly, and the ego becomes painfully aware that it is not master in its own house. 4. One is chosen to be known by God and to know him. Quote, "I knew you in the wilderness," unquote. Hosea 15:3, alternate reading. Quote, You only have I known of all the families of the earth," unquote. Amos 3:2. Other passages allude to Yahweh's need to be known. For instance, Quote, I will adopt you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you shall know that it is I, Yahweh, your God, who has freed you from the Egyptians' burdens. Exodus 6:6. This is a very important issue psychologically. Rivka Kluger notes that the Hebrew word yada, parentheses, to know, to become conscious of, close parentheses, also is used for sexual intercourse, which indicates the connection of meaning between love and knowledge. She then makes this important observation. Quote, Yahweh knows, chooses the people so that it may know him. Suggested here is the idea that God needs his vis-a-vis in order to become conscious of himself. This could not be stated more clearly than in Isaiah 48, 9 through 11. Quote, for the sake of my name, I deferred my anger, and now I have put you in the fire like silver. I have tested you in the furnace of distress. For my sake and my sake only have I acted. Unquote. We are now in a position to understand such passages. The self desperately needs the ego to know it. 5. One is chosen to be redeemed by God and to redeem him. Knowing and being known belongs to the phenomenon of consciousness, and this is redeeming. When Yahweh speaks of choosing Israel, he usually mentions at the same time redeeming them from slavery. It was for love of you and to keep the oath he swore to her. It was for love of you and to keep the oath he swore to your fathers that Yahweh brought you out of with his mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery. Deuteronomy 7:8. Encounter with the self has a redeeming and rescuing effect on the ego because it releases one from an unconscious state and reveals meaning. The reciprocal process in which the self is redeemed by the ego is also hinted in the Old Testament. Kluger has ferreted out the major passage, quote, for my sake and my sake only have I acted, says Yahweh in explaining why he afflicted the Israelites. This states explicitly that Yahweh needs Israel's awareness of him. A midrash to Psalm 91:16 says, quote, this is one of the difficult verses because this is one of the difficult verses which identify God's salvation with the salvation of Israel. Thus, Israel's fate is Yahweh's fate. This idea parallels the alchemical opus, which was an effort to redeem the divine substance hidden in the darkness of the prima materia. Okay, so that is the end of the chosen people. Now, I have a few things to say about that. I may not continue on today with the reading per se, but just make you aware of a few things. Two reasons. One, I've already been in my 2.5 hour long advanced reading group session, and the second is that I'm getting hypnotized already by this text. And so I don't want to fall asleep at the switch. And there's an interesting debate here, which I want you to be aware of. And so what I'm going to do is put a link on the YouTube channel so that you can find it. And this is the link to a book by a rabbi friend of mine. I'll tell you about him in a minute. Okay, Now, he has allowed me to publish his book on a site which I called Jung.guru. And so you will be able to read his entire book if you go to that link. Now, the reason I like that book very much is because it sat on my desk for about 7 or 8 months, but when I finally read it, I said, wow, Steve has really understood Jung and Jungian ideas. And so I was thrilled by it. I called up Steve and said that we had to make an audiobook about this immediately, which we did. He flew from Hartford, Connecticut to Annapolis, and in 2 days read the book himself into my um, computer. And then I spent the next 2 months editing it, editing his audio. And so we created an audible book of it as well. Um, and you can find that on YouTube, I believe, or I'm sorry, on Amazon, I believe. But um, Steve and I have a little bit of a sore spot, and that has to do with the chosen people. Now, my friend Steve is Rabbi Stephen Fuchs. He's the former president of the World Union of Progressive Jews, which has about 1.4 million members. And Steve was a classmate of mine at Hamilton College and a fraternity brother. So I've known him since 1964. But one place that I get rubbed a little bit raw by Steve is when he arrogantly continues to push on the chosen people idea when he's communicating with people who are not Jewish. And he's done that a couple of times. And I keep coming back at him and say, Steve, we're all chosen. You know, I was chosen. I was chosen because in 1918, my grandfather was engaged to a woman who, together with her 4 sisters, all died on the same weekend from the Spanish flu in Philadelphia. And if you don't know how awful that was in Philadelphia, where 16,000 people died because of a parade, very much like the Mardi Gras parade in New Orleans that we are currently experiencing. Please put into Google or Bing Spanish flu 1918 Philadelphia, and you'll get the whole story. Philadelphia ran their war bonds parade, and St. Louis canceled theirs. The difference was that Philadelphia had 16,000 people die of the Spanish flu, and St. Louis only had 700 die. And so that's an important story in its own right. But the result of that event was that my grandfather married my grandmother, and therefore I can exist. And you're now watching this video, which would not have happened if he had married the unfortunate woman who died. And so this is a very serious issue. So I feel, in a way, I'm chosen also. And everyone feels that they're chosen in every culture. So when Steve keeps referring to the chosen people in an arrogant way, it rubs me wrong because of the fact that I believe we're all chosen. And surely we are, because the chances of any of us existing are 1 over any number of ones and zeros on the denominator, because it takes 10 million sperm to for one ejaculation, and so only one of those fertilizes the egg that created you. And so that's only in your generation. If you go back to millions of generations that created you, the chances of you actually existing are beyond infinitesimal. So, um, and so James says everyone has a scintilla, obviously. And so this idea of the chosen people, while I think it held Jews together for thousands of years, in one way, it is also um, the it's also the thorn in their side or something like that. But having said that, and my reservation about that particular part, um, Rabbi Fuchs is a brilliant theologian, and he's now retired, although he's taken on a congregation in Florida now. And he has done much to reconcile Jews with Germans. He's gone to Germany and given many sermons in Protestant churches, I believe. I don't know if he's done it in a Catholic church, but and he's very well informed. And so this book that he wrote, Finding Ourselves in Biblical Narratives, is very much like the book that I'm reading now, the Bible and the Psyche, Individuation, Symbolism in the Old Testament. So Steve was kind enough to allow me to publish that book in its entirety on Jung.guru. And so that link that I provided is where you can contact or you can read the book. And if you want to get in touch with Steve, I'm sure you can find a way. And I'm talking about, I'll put his name here, Rabbi Stephen Fuchs. And please be polite with him if you communicate with him. And I'll leave it up to you to do that. And I was certainly very grateful for his book. And that's why I put 2 months of my life into editing the Audible part of his book and actually producing the Audible version of it. So it's very worthwhile, and I urge you to take a listen or read it online as you wish. Okay, now I'm going to go back to your comments. I'll pass up just normal greetings, but I'll go to the detailed ones. Dan says gods as mental or extra mental entities. Well, gods are unconscious entities, whether they're physically mental in the brain is an open question, but nonetheless, they are not physical in the sense of being out there in the physical world. They are in the metaphysical world. And that is in the unconscious, whether it be the personal unconscious or the collective unconscious. And that's what Dr. Edinger's work was, where he made Dr. Jung's work accessible to average people like you and me. Oleg says the Red Book of C.G. Jung is very similar to the Epic of Gilgamesh. They both have the same motives, themes, and archetypes. They're both about individuation process. Yes, I'm sure that's true. And James says everyone has a scintilla. Where the chosen people idea originate from in the Talmud. Well, I think I gave you all the biblical references already as I was reading this article. So, or this chapter of this book. Let me go back. I mean, you could read Reva Kluger's book, Psyche and Bible. That's one. But also the actual biblical sections. For example, Deuteronomy 14, that would be a chapter that it appears in. I'll just quickly give you the chapters. Amos 9, Micah 3, Exodus 16, um, Deuteronomy 7, um, Hosea 15, Amos 3, Exodus 6, Deuteronomy 7. And there's a midrash to Psalm 91:16, and a midrash is a rabbinical story that explains a verse of the Bible. Um, so yes, as Oleg says, and I insist, we are all chosen, and whether we choose to take up our role as mature human beings or not is up to us. And we have to grow into uh, we have to grow into knowing God. And if you're an arrogant young person who spent his whole time, his whole life in building up your ego and building up the logic that's in your ego, um, that's all well and good. You need that for your life. But then when you hit midlife crisis, what happens is that a lot of the guardrails that you put into your psyche start getting bashed down. And that's happening to all of us right now on a global basis because the coronavirus is just in there going whap, whap, whap. And and so I'll just say one thing that I said in the advanced group today, which is, you know, every contract is not worth the powder to blow it to hell unless people have a commitment to honor the contract. And so I spent a lot of logos rational time in law school and business school learning all the rules. And then I've spent the rest of my life finding out how all those rules are broken every day of the week. And they're only quote unquote aspirational. That's a long story. I'm not going to get into it here. But the point is, you have to have a strong enough ego to survive and keep your mental health together when you realize that things aren't the way you thought they were when you were a smart young buck who built up his ego. So when your ego is built up and you're fully inflated, that's when you're riding for a fall because the world doesn't work the way those rules work. Um, so I guess that's all I have to say. I'm going to discontinue at this time because I've been talking for the last 4 hours and my voice is dying. Tomorrow, I will be reading about the Babylonian captivity, which I believe is considered in the Torah to be uh, Yahweh's retribution because of um, David having improperly taken Bathsheba. But I'm not sure about that. Uh, my I'm not a theologian, so I don't claim to uh, tell you a specific thing in the Bible, but we'll all read about it tomorrow uh, in about the Babylonian captivity when the Jews were literally taken to Baghdad for 500 years, and then we'll go from there. And so they were exiled, and then they returned to Jerusalem. Um, and thank you, Tamara. I appreciate that. Um, and Oleg says, this is just like the story of Damien by Hermann Hesse. Yes, it certainly has archetypal resonances with Damien. So we're all chosen, and we all, Damien is a coming of age novel, and what Dr. Edinger is saying is that the Jewish people felt themselves chosen, which meant that as a people, they were coming of age. Um, so, they were becoming a mature civilization. So, anyway, I'm going to discontinue now, and I will be here tomorrow again at 4:30 with more of chapter 12. Thank you for joining me today.